Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, June 24th, 2009, the phrase hiking the Appalachian Trail enters the political lexicon. I know it's an extremely niche joke and reference, but it is a euphemism that I still trot out to this day from time to time. I find it to be one of the funniest failed excuses and phrases in history. But look, what was hiking the Appalachian Trail? That was what staff members of South Carolina Governor Mark Sanford had told reporters the governor was doing over the previous few days when he was basically nowhere to be seen. In fact, what the governor was doing was he was in Argentina, among other things, visiting a mistress of his, a woman with whom he had had a 5-year relationship that he claimed he was in Argentina to try and unravel. Oh, by the way, this trip to Argentina, it was partially paid for with taxpayer money, which was really ended up being one of the big things at the center of all this. So, listeners, take off your hiking boots, gather around the campfire, let's make some s'mores, and talk about the tale of Mark Sanford, the Appalachian Trail, and his Argentinian escapades. Here to discuss, as always, are Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
I feel like our entire show has just been a countdown clock to finally getting to this story.
Agreed.
We've wanted to do it from the jump. But one thing we should do is kind of get the timeline in order here because it is a little confusing. So, NIki, can you just start by laying out, there are rumors that Sanford has a mistress in Argentina, and he then, to try and dispel these rumors, goes to Argentina without telling anyone?
I mean, I feel like the more that you press on any part of Mark Sanford's logic in this story, you are going to find how paper thin it all is. And I'm sure we'll get into all this. But to help you with the timeline. So Sanford meets Maria Belanchapur, who is this Argentinian journalist, in 2001. And he says that nothing happens between them until 2008. He takes a business trip to Argentina in 2008, part of his tour of South America that he's doing for some economic development trip as governor of South Carolina. And he goes back down in 2009. He just kind of disappears. And this is the way it unfolds for the public, which is people are trying to get a hold of the governor of South Carolina, and nobody knows where he is. His family doesn't seem to know where he is. His staff doesn't seem to know where he is. And he runs the state. And so there's some concern that something has happened to him because nobody knows where the governor is. And his staff says, well, he's out of touch because he's out hiking the Appalachian Trail. And basically nobody believes him. No. And there's a hint of this affair, as you were talking about, and a enterprising local journalist goes to the Atlanta airport and waits for flights coming from Argentina, and lo and behold, there's Mark Sanford.
Yeah. So this Appalachian Trail excuse was one that was sent, you get the feeling that it was sent by an exasperated staff member late. It was sent late at night after a day or two of speculation, and it was basically like, I just got to come up with something. And so it was, okay, he's hiking, the logic there being like, He's hiking. He doesn't have cell reception. We can't get to him. Yeah. He's completely off the grid. Whereas I think someone had actually already seen him getting on a plane going to Argentina at this point. And then, Kellie, we can get into this, but like as he's in Argentina, there's actually some real like international sleuthing going on here because the Argentinian press picks up on it and starts to see Mark Sanford down there as well.
Oh man, it's bad because it's just like one story begets another story and another story, and so when it all sort of falls out that like he's having an affair, it's this divorced woman who I think is in her 40s who has 2 children. They're trying to figure out who she is. It's not clear that his wife knew about this. He says he went to Argentina to really end it. That he spent the last 5 days he was there crying about this relationship. But I mean, this was not just, a short-lived affair. This took place over years. And so trying to get him to really be honest in the media about what was happening was just, oh my gosh, it was so much. And it just became a rolling scandal in terms of should he step down? Should he keep his job? And he constantly trying to pivot around those messages.
Yeah. When he comes back, he tries to, he cops to having been in Argentina, and he basically tries to, I think, walk 2 parallel, possibly conflicting arguments, but somehow just have it both ways, which is to say, this was actually a business trip. What a coincidence that this business trip to Argentina, of all places, happened at this time when these rumors were starting to fly about your Argentinian mistress. But then he said this was really a business trip. I was intended to go down there, but then while I was down there, I realized I needed to see this woman and try to wrap it up, which I think was also not truthful either.
It begs the question, like, what is the governor of South Carolina? What business does he have in Argentina?
For repeated trips over the course of a couple of years. That's true.
Yeah.
The important trade relations between Argentina and South Carolina. Both big barbecue places, so maybe. Yeah, and he also it is this moment where he is quite candid about his emotions. And in fact, while I'm very much for men getting in touch with their emotions, a little too candid. He talks about her as his soulmate and how happy he is that he at least got this small amount of time with his soulmate. And it's like, dude, your wife is still your wife.
Yeah.
And your kids are listening to this. It was such a bizarre set of interviews that he gave after all of this came out.
Yeah, I mean, look, people are allowed to have winding paths, to stay on our Appalachian Trail metaphor here, winding paths in their, personal discovery and their, and who knows, the fickle ways of love. But like, he was married, he had kids. This was a secret relationship. We'll get to this at the end. I mean, they do genuinely seem to have had real affection for each other. It wasn't, just a fling. I mean, they stayed together for a while. But yes, in terms of how it was handled, and then a classic, like, it's not the crime. There's no crime here, but it's not the crime. It's the cover-up scenario here. And in there, it's the trying to evade and making up this ridiculous excuse, using taxpayer money to fly to Argentina, almost $10,000, and then claiming that actually you hadn't, and then saying, oh, well, I'm going to reimburse this. I mean, it was just a real sort of, hey, keep digging kind of situation here.
Yeah, it got messy and messy and messy. And it's so funny to me. I think about like the backlash in terms of how other politicians were responding to this, because I'm always like, ooh, the first one to speak usually has dirt as well. Like, I feel like there's always a lot of politicians never want to speak up about like these adulterous affairs because they're probably having them themselves. But like, it's interesting who was like, hey, you should step down. Like Huckabee's like, you should step down. Was Huckabee, what was he, the governor of,
he was the ex-governor at this point of Arkansas.
Former governor says that he should step down. Other politicians were just like, I'm disappointed in you, and that's about it. But also Lindsey Graham says, I hope Mark will reconcile with this family and continue serving as the state's governor. So, I mean, there's a lot of interest here to get him to either be honest or step down, or at the very least, make it right with your family.
So to that end, NIki, maybe help paint a little bit of the larger context of both, where we are politically in June of 2009, and then also very related, where we are kind of media-wise, because this was, no surprise, absolute fodder for cable news.
Absolutely. So Sanford was in the public spotlight. He was the head of the Republican Governors Association, which is a more prominent leadership position for Republican governors. It's something that Haley Barbour had been on. It was kind of a launching pad to make you a more national figure. And even though he was not involved in Congress, he had spent a lot of time attacking Barack Obama's stimulus program, which at the time at $787 billion was considered this enormous bill that the Obama administration was pursuing during the financial crisis. And he was trying to set himself up for a presidential run in 2012. So here he was trying to sort of get involved in these national fights. So he had become a much more public figure. It was a time, the Tea Party is starting to heat up. So there's a lot going on in Republican politics more generally. And there's more cable news. There's more social media. Twitter's not like a huge thing yet. It had only been around for a little while. But there is a real attention to politics, and there are all kinds of like gossipy blogs and things that are picking this up and amplifying it. That said, it also feels like the end of an era in some ways. And see, I'm curious if you agree with this. In the mid-1980s, there's this moment when Gary Hart is involved in an affair, and it becomes sort of front page news. It's one of the first times that reporters are willing to expose the personal lives of politicians, which they had largely covered for in an earlier era. The Sanford revelation feels like the last time that something as ordinary as a marital affair becomes big news like this. And I wonder if part of it is like John McCain had been the Republican nominee in 2008. He's someone who had had an affair and gotten remarried. Newt Gingrich had been the Republican leader in the 90s as somebody who had been married and cheated on his former wives repeatedly. There had been all of those Republican politicians who had impeached Bill Clinton, who it was revealed that they had had affairs. It's like that focus in the media and in politics, the punishment that comes with having an affair seems to have come to an end. This is like the last hurrah.
Well, I mean, Anthony Weiner might like a word, I mean, that's a few years later. But I do think...
Or even Trump, I think Stormy Daniels,
Sure.
But I also think that, I wonder how much of this is gendered. Like when we think is scandal for women sex and scandal for men money? Like, is it about money that's being misused, or is it about the affair itself that becomes the scandal? I don't always know like how these things play out, but I do realize that some of this stuff I think is also colored by who is perceiving this to be a problem.
Yeah. And I mean, it is worth kind of distinguishing, I think, Nikki, you were getting at this a little bit, between something can be a huge, huge, huge story, and especially for a kind of media that is rising here, and then Twitter will just come to sort of fully engulf. That doesn't necessarily mean there are consequences, right? And those things start to disconnect from each other. So, Anthony Weiner, faces consequences, but Sanford, it's worth saying, doesn't resign. He actually goes on, he's, I think, the butt of a joke for much of the rest of his, he will be the butt of a joke for his career, but nevertheless, he gets elected to Congress again, and, he's had a political career. Maybe his presidential aspirations took a hit there. But, the Trump stuff, the Stormy Daniels stuff, great Twitter fodder. What's the actual consequence of that? Nothing, right? And so I think maybe we're starting to see just the divergence between the stuff that gets people in a tizzy. We still like to get in a tizzy about sex scandals, but do they actually have consequences? Maybe no. And yeah, you think about what would happen. I mean, if this Mark Sanford thing broke right now, right, or let's say while Trump was president, like literally the reaction from people would be like, "Oh, I didn't see that tweet," or "I don't know about the story," and they just kind of like tread water for a little bit and trust that people are going to get their jokes off, but then at the end of the day, there aren't going to be any consequences. Because
no one's going to jail for an affair. You know what I mean? Like no one is it's something that you can completely recover from. And sometimes even exceed your potential even after. People forget, people move on. I don't know. Maybe that's sort of the beauty of the media in some ways, that you can bounce back.
Yeah. Any final thoughts here?
Well, the final things that I'll say about Mark Sanford is, you mentioned that he ran for and won a seat in Congress in the House where he had served before. it had been floated that Jenny Sanford, his wife, who had a political career in her own right as his campaign manager for many years, might run for that seat. She ultimately didn't. He pops back up again in late 2019, threatening to challenge Donald Trump for the nomination in 2020 because he feels that Donald Trump has not been fiscally responsible. So for 2 months, Donald Trump had a Republican challenger in the form of Mark Sanford.
I forgot
managed
about
to forget that less than 1 year later. And of course,
a few things have happened
yes,
since
and
then.
of course, as shameless as he is, Trump went after him for this very thing that we're discussing here and mocked him for having an affair. Donald Trump mocked someone for having an affair. Whatever. But yes. Yes. Okay. Final note. Yeah, that can be our final note. Our actual final note will be a recommendation from me that listeners, you should actually hike the Appalachian Trail. It is really beautiful. It's not just an excuse that you use when you are using taxpayer money for nefarious purposes. It is actually wonderful. We're going into the summer, so anyone out there who has hiked the Appalachian Trail, let us know what that's like, or anyone who is going to hike portions of it this summer, let us know, because
let us know if you have cell phone reception.
That's right.
That's the thing. Yes, finally debunk this story. Yeah. Okay. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
And so the bottom line is this. I've been unfaithful to my wife. I developed a relationship with which started as a dear, dear friend from Argentina. But here recently, over this last year, it developed into something much more than that. I heard a lot of different folks. And all I can say is that I apologize.
Radiotopia.